Hi, this is Steve McGough, OHS class of 1972. In this episode of Owatonna's hockey history, I'm going to talk about Owatonna's midget and juvenile teams of the 1960s who were real powerhouses, as you'll see. And this is really a collaboration between myself and Doug Austin, who was a goalie from the class of 68 and played on most of these teams. Um, Without the news articles and pictures and stories that he's provided, I wouldn't be able to do this episode. So we'll go through these slides, and I think you'll be pretty impressed about the teams that Owatonna fielded back in the 60s. This is a picture of a Owatonna Bantam team from the late 1950s, I guess. You can see in the front row and kneeling down there is Nicky Larice. Jim Austin is a goalie holding the trophy, so they obviously won something, which isn't surprising based on what they're going to do in the next coming years. Next to Jim Austin is Steve Chadwick, and then I'm not sure the next guy, but the one on the end is Dennis Jacobs, it looks like. Then in the back you have Kenny Austin. He would have been one of the coaches along with Kyle Peterson on the other end, who played for the Gophers. Next to Kenny you have Squeak Mallman, and then there's Randy Clemmer, Rod Block, Denny Ewell, Noel Janke, Gary McCord, and I'm not quite sure the last couple guys. Some of the faces look kind of funny because I think this picture was a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. So this is the best we could do, but I wanted to throw it in here instead of going back and adding it to the episode about the Bantam teams. This is a picture of the Elks Bantam team. It's probably the late 50s here. And you have Bill Barnett on the left, Steve Chadwick standing behind Doug Austin, who's the goalie, and then Bob Dorschner and Craig Jensen. And four of these guys would be teammates for quite a while, all the way up through juveniles, I believe. So this is in their early years. And this was obviously taken inside Wierzinski's old chalet, and you can see some of the wood bench behind there, and just it looks like it was uninsulated, and there's a advertisement for B1 lemon lime soda, which I do not remember ever hearing of, so guess they probably weren't around very long. I had this picture in the last episode, and I finally found a news article that talked more about this picture, and it was taken in March 1959, and it was a picture of the Owatonna Midget League champions, which were Oakdale Drugs. And the people in it, left to right, are John Hansen, Mike Rolke, Doug Austin is a goalie. Behind him is Tom Rowley. And then Nicky Larice looks ready for action next to Doug. The coach was Doug Ewell. And then Dave Russell, Jerry Brown, and Rod Block. So four of those guys would go on to play on the midget and probably the juvenile teams. John Hansen, Doug Austin, Nicky Larice, and Rod Block. So they didn't know it here, but they were going to be teammates for quite a while in the future. The Owatonna midget team history is sparkled with great teams, and I'll talk about those as we go through this presentation. So before the 60-61 season, the American Hockey Association of the U.S. designated new team brackets, and this would make it more consistent with the Canadian system. So you got squirts, peewee, bantam, midget, juvenile, and junior brackets, and Owatonna had both midget and juvenile teams through the 67-68 season. And the midgets went to the state championship tournament each year. And for the first 5 years, they were in every championship game. And they won one title. They had four runner-up teams, and then there was also a consolation and sportsmanship trophy later on in '67. So they had quite the run, and they also played in two national midget tournaments, and in one of them they came away with the runner-up trophy. So pretty impressive record there. So as the new decade got underway, we had a new president, and he said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Well, that would happen 8 years later in 1969, but unfortunately Kennedy wouldn't be around to see it. But he had more things to worry about. We were always, there was always the threat of the Cold War. The Soviets were going to bomb us, and then found out that they supposedly put missiles in Cuba, which was, here it shows the range, so it could hit a large part of the U.S., including Minnesota. So, that stuff seems so far away, though. It was like we were insulated in Owatonna from a lot of this stuff. Excuse me. And then they finally reached, the Soviets and the U.S. finally reached an accord, and Khrushchev said he would remove the missiles under UN watch, so that diplomatic crisis blew over, thank God. This is the first picture I have of a midget team from Owatonna. It's the 1962 team that had a 14-2 record. The only thing I could find out about the 1961 team is they went up to Duluth, where they had the state tournament that year, and they lost to Duluth Lower Chester 2-0. So in this team, let me go through all the players. In the front is Doug Austin, Nicky Larice, Squeak Malman, Lee Hara, Rod Block, Jerry Johnson, and Jim Austin, Doug's brother. In the back is Doug and Jim's dad, assistant coach Ken Austin, Jim McNichol, John Boomer McLaughlin, John Hansen, Denny Ewell, Noel Janke, Keith Farrington, Randy Clemmer, Dennis Wavern, Gary McCord, and Coach Ron Woody. And this is one of the few pictures I have with Lee Hara in it. He doesn't know it yet, but in January of 1969, he would be one of the unlucky 58,000 that was one of the soldiers killed in Vietnam, unfortunately. That was a pretty tragic moment for Owatonna, and Owatonna hockey in particular. And this picture, Doug Austin, this is the first team he was on, first midget team, and he played on 6 of the 8 midget teams, so he was a great source of stories and information about most of these teams. And their dad, Kenny, in the back, had been coaching Owatonna hockey since he showed up in town in the 50s. And later on in life, Doug and Jim both did a lot of coaching. Jim went out to play at Colorado College and ended up staying there, and he coached, I believe it was the Cheyenne High School, and I think they won a couple state championships out there. And Doug coached over in Wausau, Wisconsin, and also coached the goalies up at Rosemont. So they carried on their dad's legacy. And you can see in front of Lee and Rod, there's a number of trophies, and unfortunately, I'm not sure I'm sure the big one is probably the state runner-up trophy. They went up to Duluth again and lost in the championship game to Duluth Longview this time, 5-3. So that's about all the information I have about that team, but there were a lot of really great players on there. You had 3 of them that ended up playing Division I hockey in the WCHA. Doug went up to play at North Dakota and UMD, and Jim played out at Colorado College, and Noel Janke played for the Gophers. And you also had Boomer McLaughlin, you had Denny Ewell, so there were a lot of great athletes in this picture. This is a picture of the 1962 midget team at practice, I would assume, or maybe it's before they're getting ready for a game, but a lot of the same guys from the previous picture are in here. You got Squeak Mallman, Nicky Larice, Randy Clemmer, Steve Chadwick, Jerry Johnson, Keith Farrington, Denny Ewell, Rod Block, Mike Owens in the front there next to Jim Owen, and then Boomer McLaughlin's next to Rod. Then you have Doug and Jim Austin playing goalie. And you can see in the background, you know, what when we used to play, they didn't have the plexiglass back then. It was just wire. They go down to the hardware store and buy, and sometimes you got some real goofy bounces off the, you know, when the puck would hit the mesh just right, it would, never knew where it was going to go. It wasn't quite like, you know, the plexiglass where you have a pretty good idea of where it might go. So anyway, this is old-time hockey at its best. 1963 came in, and it was the 1960s were a very turbulent decade. A lot of things going on. And one of the big events in 1963 was that President Kennedy was assassinated down in Dallas by Lee Harvey Oswald. And a couple of days later, they're bringing Lee Harvey Oswald out of the jail and going to take him to court or wherever they're going to hold him a little bit better, a little more securely. And Jack Ruby, the guy on the right, puts a gun into his side and pulls the trigger right on national TV. It was pretty incredible. But, you know, those were just a couple of the things that went on in 63 and in the 60s. Here you have a picture of the 1963 Owatonna Midget team. That was a real powerhouse. They ended up becoming the state champions, but I'll go into that in more detail. So in the front row, a lot of the same guys from 62 are on here, but go through here, we got Doug Austin, Dennis Wavrin, John Hansen, Joe Dino McMahon, Ron Nelson, Randy Clemmer, Jim Austin, and Bob Nelson, who was the manager. In the back was Coach Ron Woody, Gary McCord, Rod Block, Jerry Johnson, Noel Janke, Boomer McLaughlin, Keith Farrington, Denny Ewell, Bill Nelson, and then the assistant coach, Kenny Austin. And these guys, I mean, they left quite the legacy, a lot of incredible players on this team. And I'll go into more detail about that. So this was a real dominating team. They had a record of 17-4 overall, and they had 2 losses to high school teams and 2 losses to juvenile teams. Other than that, they just 11-0 versus other midget teams. Against those midget teams, they scored 77 goals, which is an average of, if I did my math right, 7 goals a game. And they only let in 7 goals the whole time they played against the midget team. So that's less than a goal a game. You're going to win quite a few games playing like that. So I finally figured out that the lines would have been Noel Janke, Randy Clemmer, and Boomer McLaughlin on one line. And then the second line would have been Denny Ewell, Keith Farrington, and Dennis Wavrin. And they also had a third line that played quite a bit. Dino McMahon, Bill Nelson, and John Hansen. And on defense, you had Jerry Johnson and Rod Block and Gary McCord, and I think it's Ron Nelson played defense. Jim Austin had 9 shutouts that year, and in the state tournament, Noel Janke was named the MVP, and Jim Austin was voted the outstanding goalie of the tournament for the second straight year. So it's pretty impressive that, you know, this little town in southern Minnesota could keep up with all the big boys in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and also the northern teams. And three players, Jim Austin, Doug Austin, and Noel Janke, all played WCHA hockey, which is quite an accomplishment from a town that didn't have a high school program back then. So this team headed to the state tournament again, and for the third straight year, and this year they were hoping to make it back to the championship game and this time take the title. Their first opponent was going to be one of the tournament favorites, Shop Pond of St. Paul. And that news article gives directions to Aldrich Arena, which was brand new. It was up on White Bear Avenue. And it tells a little bit about who else was in the tournament. It said Duluth will play Minneapolis. They usually were broken up into smaller neighborhood teams, so I'm not sure which Minneapolis that would have been. And the lower bracket had St. Paul Phelan opposing Edina, and then I guess Virginia got a bye into the semifinals. So it said that they had a 12-2 overall record this year, 8-0 against midget teams, which they outscored 65-2. That's just incredible. Jim Austin had 8 shutouts in the net, and surprise, surprise, Noel Janke and Denny Yule were the top scorers. So Kenny Austin said that a few parents drove the team up in their cars because the Owatonna JC's only budgeted $400 a year for uniforms, and that was it. So you had pretty much a lot of the same parents driving all the time. Some of the, like my parents didn't drive, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, but we had one car. Some of these guys were able to go on road trips with no problem, but some of the regular drivers, it sounded like, were Chuck Hosfield, Eddie Block, Werner Janke, Dennis Wavern, and Mutt Matichek. And I was thinking about this last night before I was doing this slide presentation, and I don't think I ever remember anyone ever having an accident on there, and thank God. So got to give credit to all those parents who drove these kids around, on these treacherous highways back then, and managed to make it there and back safe and sound. So that's always a good thing. So Owatonna went up to the midget tournament, and first game they played St. Paul Shop Pond, and it started out, it was they played kind of slowly, and it was 2-2 after the first period. And then they got 3 more goals in the second period, and we're up 5-3 after the second period. And then Jim Austin shut them down after that and added another goal in the third period. It said Noel Janke had a couple goals, and also Denny Yule, Randy Clemmer, and Gary McCord scored. And in the second game, they beat Duluth Portman. And Duluth Portman had ousted the defending champ Duluth Young Longview from the tournament this year. But Owatonna started out, and there was really no contest. And the newspaper article got cut off a little bit, but it was 4-0 after 2 periods, and then they let in a harmless goal in the closing stanza. But it said Denny Yule had 2 goals, and John McLaughlin or Randy Clemmer got the other 2. So on they went to play Virginia off the Iron Range, and those northern teams always thought they could stick it to the southern boys, and not this time. And Owatonna beat them 2-1 to win the state tournament. And it said the scores after the first and second period. After the first period, it was scoreless, and then Owatonna got a couple of goals in the second period from Denny Yule on a breakaway, and Noel Janke got the winner on an assist from Jerry Johnson. And Virginia made things a little tight in the third period when they got a goal. But Owatonna really did well in this one. And Ron Woody, the coach, said, quote, "A number of our boys won individual honors, but it took all 15 of them to win the title. Each and every one of them deserves credit for 6 years of hard work together. This was the 4th state midget tournament for 10 of our boys, all sophomores in high school. We'll be leaving the program after this year. I'm proud of them all," unquote. So, that's what you want to hear from the coach. It's all teamwork. It's you might have a couple guys that do a lot of the scoring or shut down people, but everybody's contributing. And so when they won the state tournament, they got invited to go play in the National Midget Tournament, which would have been held March 30th and 31st at Fort Wayne, Indiana. And it said that Sault Ste. Marie would be there, the host Fort Wayne, Toledo, Ohio, Boston, Mass. I think it was actually a Marlboro, one of the suburbs of Boston. Also Green Bay and Beloit, Wisconsin, and Wilmette, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. So on to the Nationals. Here's another article that talks about how they won the tournament. And it said when they got home, they were escorted by a police escort in about 40 horn-tooting cars. And it said, Kenny Austin said it was a real achievement by a fine team effort of 15 boys, culminating 6 years of hard work. And it just kind of tells pretty much the same thing as the other article about who would be at the tournament. But you can see there, in the picture, they're a pretty happy bunch of guys. Got a nice, must have been some of the individual trophies there from, for Noel and Jim for their outstanding individual work, and then the championship trophy. I'd really be curious to know where all these trophies ended up, if they're still around. It'd be kind of interesting to see where they are and what kind of shape they're in, and maybe take a couple pictures of them. These are a couple pictures that were in the newspaper when the boys came home after winning the state tournament. And you can see their trophies on top of the car in the left photo. And probably one was, for Noel and maybe Jim Austin, plus the championship trophy. And you can see, the guys, looks like Rod's got all kinds of, I'm not sure what he's got pinned on his coat there. But in the picture to the right, I thought it was kind of funny. All the guys are wearing white socks, black shoes, and, shorter pants, cuff pants. So they're pretty nicely dressed. This is a picture. It's a little grainy, but it shows the captain and the two alternate captains of the 63 championship team. Left to right, you have Noel Janke, then Denny Yule in the middle, and Rod Block on the right. And Noel's holding his MVP trophy, and then Denny, it looks like, is standing in front of the traveling championship trophy that's awarded to the winning team each year. And I think Rod is holding the permanent championship trophy that's stayed in Owatonna. Then there's a regional championship, and also Jim Austin's most outstanding goalie award. So, excuse me. These guys were some amazing athletes. Noel and Denny are both in OHS Athletic Hall of Fame, and I mean, these guys were playing all kinds of sports. Not only were they playing hockey in the winter, but they were also co-captains of the OHS basketball team. So, these guys lived to compete, and whatever sport they were in, they tried to be their best. And I'm not sure if many people know this, but Denny Yule got hit in the eye with a hockey stick when he was younger, so he could only see out of one eye. which was it's pretty amazing playing all those sports where it requires pinpoint accuracy. Whether it's passing the football or playing baseball or hitting the hockey puck. You got playing with only one eye had to be quite a liability, but he managed to do pretty well. This is a picture of the bus that the people rented to drive down to Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was taken in front of the Holiday Inn down there. And they rented this 41 passenger bus and raised $1,000 to go down there. I don't know if that was just the cost of the bus or some meals for the kids, for some of the players. But they had a presentation the night before they left and gave all the players a nice coat that had a logo of the state of Minnesota with a star showing where Owatonna was located, and obviously a team name on their coat somewhere so people could figure out where they were from. So this looks like, I'm sure these guys had a fun time. And back then, Holiday Inn to me was, you're pretty high class when you were staying at that place. So I think it's changed in the recent years, but back then it was a pretty good place to stay, and I'm sure these people had a lot of fun. This is a Google Maps that I just recently printed, just showing the route that the bus would have taken from Owatonna down to Fort Wayne, in case anybody is wondering where it's located. And it says it's 549 miles, and it would take you 1 minute more than 9 hours to get there. And that's assuming you get on the interstate, which would probably be almost all the way over to Fort Wayne, and just set it on cruise control. But the reality back in 1963 was a little bit different. Most of the time you were probably driving on narrow 2-lane roads, snow piled on the side, not much of a shoulder. It was pretty treacherous driving. And I guess what'd they say, 7 or 9 cars, 7 cars went along with the bus, so they had a pretty good contingent going to the tournament from Owatonna. So the reality of driving in 1963 is, when you're driving back then, you're going through every small town between between Owatonna and Fort Wayne, and end of the winter you might have a little less snow, but it's probably still piled up, and it's just pretty hazardous driving back then. And then when they went through Chicago and Gary, Indiana, which is right on the south end of Lake Michigan, you would have been seeing this kind of stuff. So it was treacherous times driving back then. Owatonna's first opponent would be Beloit, Wisconsin, and they would play at 11:15 a.m. on Saturday morning. Other teams in the tournament were Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and they're going to play Toledo, Ohio in the first tournament game. Then Wilmette, Illinois against Fort Wayne, and Marblehead, Mass, Boston Suburb versus Green Bay, Wisconsin. And it just talked a little bit about who was going. But one thing I found interesting is the ice had melted down on the river, so these guys had no skating ability to skate for a couple weeks, so they entered a juvenile tournament up in the cities where they'd be playing against guys that were a couple of years older than them. They said they warmed up for the national tournament, and they beat the Edina Juveniles 7-2 in a practice game. And this was the same Edina team that beat Owatonna, the Owatonna Juvenile team 4-3 in overtime in the semifinals of the state tournament. So I'm sure there was a lot of razzing going on, with between some of these guys who might have had an older brother on the juvenile team, and gave him a bunch of guff for losing to the same team that they pummeled pretty well. These are our next couple slides are pictures that somebody took inside the bus, and you can see some of the players there. It looks like you're looking towards the back of the bus, and some guys are up in the luggage racks up there. Some are just kind of reclining. I don't know about you guys, but I can't sleep on a bus. I have to be laying down on a bed, so I think a lot of people on the bus must have felt the same way, because the stories that came back were a lot of people just didn't sleep at all during the night all the way down to Fort Wayne. And if that is the back of the bus, it doesn't look like there's a toilet back there, so that must have been a long, uncomfortable ride at times for some of the people there. This is another picture inside the bus. This is more of the players. There's a couple parents in there. I see Sue Janke almost right in the center of the picture there. Tommy McLaughlin's in the front on the left. And you can see more, I guess the jackets were red, and you can see the outline of Minnesota, and probably says JC, Owatonna JC hockey or something to that effect. And Tommy McLaughlin here doesn't know that before this trip is over, he's going to end up soaking wet after he got thrown in the pool fully clothed down in Fort Wayne at the Holiday Inn. In September 2018, we had a 50-year high school hockey reunion, and a lot of the old timers showed up. And here's a picture of one of the red coats. You can see it says 1963 Minnesota Midget Champions, Owatonna. And these are the coats. Noel Janke has actually held on to his all these years and brought it to the reunion. So now you can see in color what they looked like. And some of the old timers that showed up are left to right, Tom Stanton. He was in one of the pictures in the Bantam years, I think from 1953. He was playing Bantam, so he's definitely one of the old timers. Next to him is Joe Dina McMahon, excuse me, Doug Austin, Noel Janke, and Bob Grotham. So these were the guys that made up a lot of the midget teams. Well, not Tom Stanton, he was before. But the other four were the ones that made up some of the players on some of those great teams. And Tom Stanton, I played with him on Weber's Bar, and we'll talk more about that in one of the future episodes. This just shows some of the players sitting in the stands watching the first game before their game, before they went down to get dressed. Probably wondering, checking out who they might have for a potential opponent there. They celebrated some birthdays down there, and it sounds like there's a box full of cupcakes, and somebody accidentally dropped it. I guess Noel's mom did. And they had a big cake, and that made it back to Owatonna in one piece. I'm not sure why they waited to go back to Owatonna to eat the cake, but they did. And then the picture on the right is for Mrs. Clemmer, Vi Clemmer. She had a birthday, so they put one candle on there. I guess Gary McCord also had a birthday, and caption at the end of the picture, bottom of the picture says, Tommy McLaughlin Center is really not as tall as he appears above, but he's still growing. So local hometown newspaper reported. Lady named Grace Tolbert showed up. I guess one of her passions is going and watching hockey tournaments around the country and Canada. So she showed up for this and got taken under the wing by some Owatonna people, being Minnesota nice, and she sat with them through all the games and had a very high opinion of Owatonna. And she sent this letter to Kenny Austin, which is very nice, and just commended Owatonna's players and parents and supporters. So that was very nice, and it just goes to show it was a great community to grow up in, and we're doing all the right stuff and spreading some goodwill around the country. And she also wrote a poem that's on the right picture, and there's some significance there, I guess. The people who were along there would know exactly what this was about, but I'm not going to try to decipher it. But it was nice that she took the time to write this letter and commending all the people from Owatonna. Bob Siegel wrote this article for the paper, and he was tasked with not only reporting but also taking a lot of candid photos, and unfortunately his camera went on the fritz and he wasn't able to get any, so he just kind of rehashed what he saw. And I've already talked about Mrs. Tolbert, and I guess Johnny McLaughlin must have got 14 stitches at some point. I know Jim Austin got hit and had to get some stitches in the Green Bay game. And it said they got telegrams of congratulations from Austin and Albert Lee, which was really nice of them to do that. And he made one comment. He said it was a wondrous and glorious bus trip to and from Fort Wayne. Wondrous because one would sit continually wondering when pure exhaustion would put you to sleep. And I guess some people it never did. And glorious because you didn't know what glory was until you got out the vehicle at one end of the journey. Yeah, I know how that feels sometimes, especially if you have a full bladder. And, I guess there was a lot of people that just couldn't sleep, and it must have been an agonizing 9 or 10 hours of bus ride. And then talked about Mrs. Farrington and Mrs. Ewell going across shopping and crossing some pretty dicey areas from the sounds of it, wearing their high heels. And anyway, it sounds like everybody had a good time down there, and I'm sure there was some good stories that came out of that whole trip. This was an article written about the team from his point of view by Coach Ron Woody. And Ron Woody is he just rehashed. He said the first tournament was held at Colorado Springs, and the second one was at Muskegon, Michigan. And the previous champs were Detroit and Sault Ste. Marie. And Owatonna was the smallest city represented this year. And I guess the assistant to the head scout of the Blackhawks, a guy named Ken Campbell, who was the head of the St. Catherine, Ontario hockey team, showed up to check out the tournament. And St. Catherine's, here's some of the alumni: Bobby Hull, Stan Mikita, Elmer Vasco, Pierre Pilote, or Pierre Pilot, if depending on which side of the border you're on, and Eric Nestorenko. You had Glenn Hall in there, and you got pretty much the starting lineup of the Blackhawks. And anyway, he showed up, and he said he liked the ability of defenseman Gary McCord and Jerry Johnson. Thought Jim Austin was very good in the nets, and had special praise for center Denny Ewell. And center Noel Janke was rated high enough to receive an invite to participate in the Junior A tryouts at St. Catharines in August of '63. And that tryout was limited to the top 60 16-year-old hockey players in the U.S. and Canada. So the story I heard is Noel was all ready to transfer up there, and went back and told his dad that he was going to be moving to St. Catharines, Ontario, for these Junior A tryouts, and that was his dad quickly put a kibosh on that idea, but which is good for Owatonna. Imagine if he had left after his sophomore year in high school. But it talked about the Allen County Memorial Coliseum, which seated about 10,000 people. And they said it was a very good ice rink. A doctor was in attendance at each game to stitch up players when they got hit by the puck, obviously. And they said the head ref was Hal Jackson, who 2 years before had refereed one of the games in the Stanley Cup playoff and had been an NHL official for 10 years. So these guys put on a serious tournament here. And they said that everybody got together before the tournament started. Everybody met, all the coaches met with the officials, and got an idea of what was expected of everyone. And it said they beat Beloit the first game and then lost to Sault Ste. Marie. One of these next slides has all the scores of the games. But the last game they played was against Green Bay, and they were losing 4-1 going into the third period. And it said most teams would have quit and accepted defeat, but the Owatonna team showed grit and determination and fought back and literally skated Green Bay off the ice. And about this time, Jim Austin got hit in the face with a puck, so they had to stop the game and stitch him up. And Doug told me that he was 12 years old at the time. Doug Austin, his younger brother, who was also the backup goalie. And Doug was scared stiff that he was going to have to go in and play, with good reason. You don't want to be sitting on the bench cold and all of a sudden you have to come into a game in the third period and try to shut down the other team. And the winner of the tournament was Marblehead, Mass, and I guess they were allowed to bring players from, it was like an all-star team, so they probably called up, the local high schools in the area and picked all the ringers and showed up at this tournament. So, but Ron's final comment was it was an outstanding team and undoubtedly would have been able to defeat 90% of the high school teams in Minnesota. And it's too bad we didn't have a chance to prove that back then, but one can only wonder. Todd Hale wrote a column back in 1997 about the teams that went to the midget tournaments, national tournaments. So this is just a recap. I just kind of took a lot of the stuff that he had talked about and put it in my presentation. And it's kind of ironic because I'm recording this early April 2021, and he just published pretty much the same article again in this past edition of the Owatonna People's Press. So anyway, you can read all about it here, and hopefully you can read his column and then dig in a little deeper with this presentation. And this is just the text that goes along with it. So it's a great article and gives a good synopsis of what went on at the tournament, at least the stuff that can make the news. 1964 came in, and we had these guys pop up on the Ed Sullivan Show and greatly changed music and led to a cultural revolution in the later years. He also had computers being introduced at work. It's a little bigger than the computers they have nowadays. And we had our Minnesota boy Hubert Humphrey elected vice president, along with Lyndon Johnson, who was voted in the new president in 1964. Teams probably thought after a bunch of the guys left in 1963 that Owatonna's 64 midget team would be fairly weak. Well, they had another thing coming. These guys were pretty good too. So in the front row we have Dennis Jacobs, Steve Chadwick, Mike Owen, Terry Casperson, Doug Austin, John Kupke, Joe McMahon, and Chuck Cashman Jr. In the back you have Gary McCord, who is now an assistant coach after he moved on from the midget team. Ron Nelson, Randy Clemmer, John Boomer McLaughlin, Gary Anderson, Bill Nelson, Bob Johnson, Pat Kane, Bob Dorschner, and the coach Ron Woody. Looks like Ron had to use 3 or 4 beaver pelts to make that hat he's wearing there, but it's probably pretty warm. So we're going to talk about these guys. These guys are real good too. And another thing I wanted to point out, these two little sheds in the back right behind, who would it be, right behind Ron Nelson's head and his brother's head. That's where the teams used to go in between periods or before the game, and they'd suit up there, and then they were able to go in there between periods to have their pep talks and talk over strategies, so they didn't have to go into the warming house and mingle with all the unwashed masses in there. No, seriously, you wouldn't have a bunch of kids yelling at you or your buddy screaming at you, giving you crap because you're winning or losing. So that seemed to have worked out pretty well for them. So this was another Owatonna powerhouse team. They had a 23-1 record. They won. This was the initial Suburban Southern Midget League this year, and they were the champions of that league, unbeaten. They were the state midget runner-up team. They averaged more than 6 goals a game, allowed less than 2 goals a game, so you can win quite a few games when you have those averages. The leading scorers were Terry Casperson. He had 38 goals, 15 assists for 53 total points. And Pat Kennevan, not far behind, had 20 goals and 23 assists for 43 points. So between those two, they put in a lot of goals. And Doug Austin told me that Terry Casperson's backhand shot was just incredible, and I've heard that from other people too. He was just a master at the backhand shot. And Pat Kennevan was an unbelievable stick handler. So he was, having those two guys on your team, along with Boomer McLaughlin, you're gonna win a lot of games. Well, the Midgets made it to the state tournament again, which is no surprise. They beat Rochester's Midgets last Friday up at Wakota Arena, and they beat them 7-4. Pat Kennevan and Bill Nelson each had a pair of goals, and then Terry Casperson, Gary Anderson, and Dennis Jacobs scored the other 3. And Doug Austin and Charlie Cashman Jr. took turns playing. Doug played a couple periods and Charlie Cashman played 1, and they had a total of 16 saves for the game. So here we are off to another tournament, and in this one, the first game they played the Duff Falls from International Falls, and they were able to beat them 3-2. So it sounded like a really good game. It said Boomer McLaughlin opened the scoring early in the second from an assist from Randy Clemmer, and it was going 1-0 going into the third period, and then the Falls tied things up halfway through the period. Said on an open shot at goalie Doug Austin as the Owatonna defense lapsed. Then Dino McMahon scored a goal to put him ahead with about 6.5 minutes left on an assist from Clemmer and John Kupke. And then International Falls tied it up with 3.5 minutes left. So it looked like overtime at this point. But then it was Bill Nelson. It was Ron Nelson scored the winning goal, and he got it with only a little over a minute left in the game. And it was an assist from Mike Owen. It says in front of the net and lifted the puck over the goalie's stick for the victory. So there we go on to the semifinals. And the first 2 winners of the other games were St. Paul Shot Pond. They beat Duluth 4-1, and Coleraine beat Rochester 2-1. It sounded like that was a good game. It went into 2 sudden death overtimes, one which had to be played between periods in Owatonna's game. And it says Coleraine scored with less than 2 minutes left in the extra stanza, and they moved on to the semifinals. So Owatonna just had a pretty easy time in their semifinal, beating Minneapolis VFW 6-0. And I guess Barb Gaveski said, she was going to organize a bus if there were enough fans that were interested, so you had to give her a call. But it says Joe McMahon opened the scoring with a goal on assist from John McLaughlin and Randy Clemmer. And then it said he scored another one in the second period, and then Boomer McLaughlin got one. In third period, he had goals by Clemmer, McLaughlin, and Ron Nelson. And Shot Pond made it to the finals. They beat Coleraine 2-1. So here we go, on to the final again. So this is just another little newspaper article that talks about how they beat Minneapolis VFW to make it to the finals. And it said both goalies were excellent in that game. It said Doug Austin for Owatonna had 13 stops, 16 for Steve Melchizedek. And it said Owatonna scored 2 shorthanded goals, so they were clicking. But they made it to the final, and they lost again, unfortunately. But it said, let's see, I guess John Boomer McLaughlin, well, Shot Pond went up 1-0 in the first period. And it says he poked the rubber in from 10 feet out. It sounded like a rebound shot. And then Boomer McLaughlin knotted it up halfway through the second period after it sounded like a unassisted goal, maybe a breakaway. And then with about 2 minutes left, Shot Pond was a man down, and a guy named White passed it to Tom Farrell just back of the blue line. Tom wove his way around one defenseman and lit the red light from 20 feet out. And this writer says the game was marked by exceptionally fine skating and stick handling on the part of both teams. And both squads were well coached, and the sportsmanship was one of the best. So Owatonna won the sportsmanship trophy along with the runner-up trophy. And John McLaughlin and Ron Peltier were co-MVPs, which that's a pretty big honor. Ron Peltier turned out to be one of the best players produced in Minnesota. Him and his brother were pretty much synonymous. Doug Peltier, Ron Peltier, they were just synonymous with St. Paul Johnson high school hockey, and then on to the Gophers. And looked up Ron Peltier's name on the internet, and he is with Warren Buffett. I guess he runs one of their realty branches, and so he's done pretty well in his life. And looking back, I mean, he was on the all-tournament team in both 67 and 68, so he was quite the player. And for one of our guys to be, you know, a co-MVP along with him, that shows that Owatonna was producing guys that were just as good as anybody else in the state. This is a picture taken at the hockey banquet every year, and it just shows the midget team and tells who the players were and shows them with all their trophies. So I'll just go through and you guys probably know all these players, but we'll go through them anyway. So you had Ron Woody on the left, and then Terry Casperson, Bill Nelson, Bob Dorschner, then Don Niederkorn, who was the Midget League president. Bertie Johnson's back there, and then the captain, Boomer McLaughlin. It says he's holding a most valuable player trophy along with the Southern Regional title trophy and the state runner-up trophy and the sportsmanship award. So next to Boomer, we have Pat Kane, who's kind of hidden behind there, Joe McMahon, Randy Clemmer, one of the Nelson boys, Ron Nelson. He was the one holding the state championship runner-up trophy. Dennis Jacobs, Charlie Cashman Jr., Gary Anderson, John Cuppy, and then Doug standing right to the far right there. So it says a total of 225 people attended the banquet, including 120 boys who participated in the youth hockey program sponsored by the Park and Rec. So it was a real good turnout, and we still continue to produce really good teams back then. 1965, the Marines landed on the beach at Da Nang in Vietnam, and we got into a war there that would last until 1975. So all of a sudden, a lot of guys all of a sudden had to worry about being drafted like this. You could be, if you didn't have a student deferment or some kind of physical defect, you were most likely going to be drafted for at least 2 years. So kids had to worry about that now, and then getting sent over to Vietnam, and all of a sudden you're in the jungles over there, humping a pack and trying to root out some people hidden over there. And we just started getting bombarded with this stuff on TV every day. So this stuff became, instead of it being feeling distant and far away, this was hitting home, because we had a lot of guys that were going to end up drafted and ended up fighting over there. This is a picture of the 1965 Owatonna Midget team that was every bit as good as any of the previous teams, and they ended up with a 27-3 record. They finished runner-up in the state for the midgets, and also runner-up nationally for the midget team. So quite a team here. So I'll just go through the players. In the front is Terry Casperson, Pat Kennevan, Dino McMahon, Doug Austin, Greg Jensen, Dennis Jacobs, Roger Peterson, and Tom Freeberg. And in the back is Stu Woody. He was the guy that helped with the sticks and everything. Paul Arnfeld, who was the Owatonna JC's representative, Coach Ron Woody, Charlie Cashman Jr., Pat Kane, Bill Nelson, Bertie Johnson, John Kupke, Gary Anderson, Jim Quinlivan, and then Greg Maleka, who I'm not sure what his function was, and also Cliff Elmore, who was the JC's president at the time. So a lot of great players on this team again, and we'll get into more detail about their exploits. Doug had a lot of the programs from the tournaments that he went to. So this is the cover of the 1965 State Midget Tournament hockey tournament program. This is one of the pages that shows the team rosters, and I always like looking at these to see who was playing in these tournaments. So you can see under International Falls, there's a player named Ron Nagurski, who I believe is maybe have been Bronco Nagurski's grandson, because I don't know if that would be his son. And it's a guy named Richard Toninato, who I believe there's a player a couple of years ago that played on somewhere up there, Duluth East or Grand Rapids, so maybe that's some kind of relation there. And if you look under Grand Rapids, one of the coaches was Gus Hendrickson, who went on to coach Grand Rapids high school hockey team. Hired a guy named Mike Sertage to be his assistant, and then he left and went to UMD. So it's pretty interesting to see how these coaches and players evolve through the years. On this page are more team rosters, and you can see under St. Paul Phelan, one of their players was Doug Peltier, and Ron Peltier must have been there if he was, I guess he probably moved on already. But you can see the coach is Herbie Brooks, who went on to bigger and better things, obviously. And Minneapolis Pearl had a coach named Larry Hendrickson, who was Darby Hendrickson's dad. And he went on to coach either, I don't know if it was Richfield or Robbinsdale high school team. And then he was a coach at Apple Valley, who won a state championship some years ago. This is the bracket from the 65 tournament. You can see Owatonna played the third game that day, and they played Duluth Case St. Paul. I'm not sure if that's from St. Paul or from Duluth. Anyway, they beat them 9-2. So then they had to play South St. Paul, who had beaten Phelan 5-3, and they went into double overtime in that one and then made it to the finals. So we'll go through each of the games here. So Owatonna ended up playing the St. Paul Duluth case uh, on Friday night, and they beat him 9-2. And Terry Casperson had 5 goals, and Pat Kennevan had 4 assists. Then they went on to play South St. Paul the next day, and that went into 2 overtimes before Owatonna won 5-4. And it said Pat Kennevan slapped in the winning goal on assist by Casperson and Gary Anderson. And that was his gave him the hat trick right there. Gary Anderson scored a couple other goals, and Terry Casperson had 4 assists. So nothing new there. You know, Kennevan and Casperson doing a lot of the scoring. And then it says Coach Woody had special praise for defenseman Bill Nelson after the tournament, and it said he played tremendous hockey in all 3 games. And as far as he was concerned, Bill was the most outstanding hockey player in the tournament. Then you can see there's a little bit of a news article that talks about the juvenile team. They went to the state tournament and were beaten 6-5 by Edina on the opening game. Doesn't give more information about that game other than the small headline that says Noel Janke scored 4 of those 5 goals. So if anybody has any info about any of those other juvenile teams, that'd be great if they could pass it along. This was a picture that was taken after they lost to International Falls in the championship game, and you can see here the front row. You got Tom Freeberg there, Pat Kane, Terry Casperson, Pat Kennevan, Gary Peterson, and John Hosfield. In the back you have Dennis Jacobs, Gary Anderson, Charlie Cashman Jr., Greg Jensen. Doug Austin is kind of peeking in behind there. John Kupke, Ron Nelson, Bertie Johnson, Dan McMahon, and the coach Ron Woody. Another picture of one of the great Owatonna Midget teams. This is a picture taken at the in-town motel. They had a guy named Elmer Hamann, local hockey fan, brought the team down there after they came in second in the state and treated them all to a steak dinner. So I'm sure the guys were pretty happy about that. And you can see a lot of the different players in there, and the championship trophies right in front of Ron Woody there, right on the end of the table. So these guys look like they're having fun there. This is another article written by Todd Hale. I'm not sure when this was, but it's a great article. It talks about the team that won the state tournament in '63 and the team in '65. So it just I pulled a lot of stuff that he wrote and put it into this presentation. And Todd was always a great supporter of our teams, and you know, later on he became our announcer for high school. So here you can read more about the this is just more about the '63 and '65 teams, and also the first year of the high school program. So he did a good job writing these articles, and so International Falls is the Minnesota winner of the midget tournament, was invited to play in the national tournament, and they couldn't swing it financially, so they asked Owatonna if they'd be interested, and of course they were. So it's been actually April 3rd and 4th, which is the same weekend as I'm recording this. So that was let's see, 56 years ago this weekend. How time flies. So for people who may not be familiar with where Sault Ste. Marie is, it's right way at the far eastern tip of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, right on the Canadian border. In fact, half the bigger part of Sault Ste. Marie is on the Canadian side. So it says it's 626 miles, take you about 10.5 hours. Of course, that's in this day and age. And I lived up in the Upper Peninsula for a couple years, and boy, it can be a long drive across that Upper Peninsula. I mean, it's beautiful country, but the chances of you running into snow are pretty probably going to happen up there, even though it is April. So I guess they drove up to Marionette, which is on the Wisconsin-Michigan border, and spent the night there, and then drove on to Sault Ste. Marie the next day. This shows in the program the Minnesota team, and there's a couple names on there you may not be familiar with: George Becker, Mike Hansel, Joe Schaefer, and Tom Pugh. And Owatonna had come to some deal with South St. Paul where they would take a few of their players because Owatonna might have been a little short-handed. And they were informed that if they did that, those players would be ineligible to play high school hockey. So they decided to leave them home and go with what they had. And in the bottom part of this page, you can see it shows the tournament schedule. And Owatonna played Elmhurst, Illinois, 9:30 that morning and lost 5-3. Then they had to play again. Let's see, they played 3 games that day. They had to play at 12:30, and they beat Beloit, Wisconsin 10-1. So they gave them a good shellacking. And later on that afternoon, they played Denver, team out of Denver, and beat them 11-1. So they were on a roll there. Then it says on the 4th, they played Fort Wayne, Indiana, and beat them 3-2. And then I guess they lost to Sault Ste. Marie as everybody else did. So that was their tournament there. This article shows how Owatonna ended up with the championship trophy. They tied actually with the same record as Chicago and Fort Wayne, but because of the superior goal difference, they were awarded the runner-up trophy. So anyway, it talks about a little bit of the game. It says Owatonna went into Sunday competition with a 2-1 record and then beat Fort Wayne. It says by a greater margin than the final 3-2 score indicated. It says Owatonna scored twice in the first period, Casperson getting 1 goal on a rebound and a second on a pass from Pat Kenovan. And then Fort Wayne got a goal back to make it kind of close, but then Kenovan scored on an assist from Casperson. That says the lead stood up until the end of the game because Owatonna had a couple people in the penalty box. And then they had to play Sault Ste. Marie, which was, they didn't get scored upon in 5 straight games. So they had an excellent team and easily won the tournament. But, Owatonna can hold their head up. They came in second in a midget tournament, and they had some pretty big teams there. So good for them. Here's a couple pictures of the guys when they got back. They had a fire truck, and these guys got up on top of the fire truck and were paraded through town. And they said 75 people turned out, and along with cheerleaders and members of the band, as well as city officials and local radio and press. So it's a pretty big deal. Small town, doing pretty well in the tournament, so these guys can be really proud of that. And Bill Nelson is the one holding up the trophy and holding the trophy in both of these pictures. And Doug said that when they went up there, I guess Bill somehow had broken a bed in one of the hotels, and so these guys went out trying to find wood glue to glue it back together, and never heard whether they were able to do that or not. But Doug said Bill Nelson was a pretty funny guy. He kept people loose around the locker room, so they had a lot of fun. 1966 came in, and this is just kind of a synopsis of things that were happening in the U.S. at that time, and it's pretty interesting to look. What the average house price cost was $14,200. You're making about $6,900 a year, and cost of gas was 32 cents. seem to remember it was even less than that at times. Some of the popular music, the Monkees, they were huge back then. The Trogs, I remember a couple of their songs, Wild Thing. The Beatles, of course, Temptation, Motown. Surfing music from the Beach Boys, and then the great Simon and Garfunkel, and more Motown from the Supremes. And some of the popular movies, I don't know if this was the first spaghetti western that Clint Eastwood did, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Also, you had the Batman. I don't remember it being a movie. I remember it being a TV series, but if it was a movie, it was probably the first of 100 Batman movies that seem to have been made since then. And then some of the events that happened, the Astrodome was built, but third thing on this bullet list was interesting. It said the draft deferment test is started in the U.S. as a way for students to convince the draft board that they would serve the nation better in the quiet of the classrooms rather than the jungles of Vietnam. So I had to look up what the draft deferment test, and it was pretty tough. I mean, you couldn't fake your way into college to get a student deferment. You had to actually pass this test, and I think you had to prove that you passed it when you applied for college. But it tested your reading skills, your math skills, and analytical skills. So it sounded like it was pretty tough. And I know, a lot of the guys, they didn't have plans. Come on, they're like, mid to late teens, and they hadn't figured out what they wanted to do in life yet. But they sure didn't want to end up here, out in the jungles, wading through streams and swamps and getting shot at. And the troop levels in Vietnam at this time were 385,300. So Westmoreland kept calling for more troops to quell the war over there. I only have a few articles from 1966, and this is one of them. It says they just beat the Albert Lee Midgets in a Southern Suburban League game to make their record 1-1-3. So this team may not have been as dominant as some of the previous ones, but they still made it to the state tournament. And it said that Roger Peterson got 4 goals, Pat Canavan added 2, and right winger Tommy McLaughlin rounded out the scoring with the other goals. So you can see Tom McLaughlin is being eased into the team after his brother moved up. And it says Coach Woody praised the play of his first line that also included wing Dave Chesney, in addition to Peterson and Canavan. So another year, another good team. This is one of the few articles I have on the juvenile team. It said they were going to play Edina in a Southern Suburban League game that day up at Wakota Arena. Then they're playing juvenile or Columbia Heights, and then they actually play against the Albert Lee High School. And it said their only loss in 8 games was against the Albert Lee High School, and they beat them on the rematch. So, and it said the high spot of the season for the juveniles came here last Saturday night when Coach Woody's Charges played very well in edging the Mankato State College 6. Wow, 4-3. So that's pretty impressive. It said Mike Owen scored, Boomer McLaughlin and Terry Casperson scored a couple goals at the end. And in another game they played, they beat Robbinsdale 3-2, and then turned back previously unbeaten Roseville 4-2. And the ones who scored there, Randy Clemmer, John McLaughlin, Terry Casperson, and Gary Anderson. So those guys moved up and just continued their strong play, and said they were leading the Beltline Juvenile League with a perfect 3-0 mark. And this is a public notice for Youth Hockey Week in the U.S. signed by Kenny Austin, who was the mayor at that time. And it just said, during the week of January 20th, they were going to focus public attention on the physical character building and other benefits of hockey for our youth. Yes, very true. And it says the game of hockey teaches our youth to develop a competitive spirit, cooperation with others, bodybuilding, and respect for authority. Also very true. And so he declared that the week commencing January 20th be observed as Youth Hockey Week in the U.S. and requested that all parents and others support this observance by attending games during Youth Hockey Week and thereafter until the hockey season ends. And at the bottom in big bold letters it says, "Don't send," and there's a bold there, "Take your boy to the rink." So obviously this is before girls played, but now they can say, "Take your boy and girl to the rink and let them have fun." This is a picture of the 1966 Owatonna Juvenile team. And this is one of the few articles and pictures that I have from the juvenile teams. And these guys were pretty good. They won their Beltline League championship with a 9-1 record. Their overall record was 21-3, and they lost to the eventual state champs in the first round of the state tournament. Not sure who that was. There wasn't much information about that. This picture was taken of the team at one of the hockey banquets, and the keynote speaker there was Lou Nanny, who's at the far left of the picture, and he had been playing for the Gophers, and he had led the WCHA in scoring as a defenseman. So not only could he play defense, but he could also score. And the other people in the picture are Gary Anderson. Behind him is Carl Sainert, who was one of the assistant coach, Doug Austin, John Kupke, Roger Peterson, John McLaughlin, Dino McMahon, Bertie Johnson, Ron Nelson, and then Bill Nelson in the glasses, Terry Casperson, Pat Kennevan, Chuck Cashman Jr., and the coach Ron Woody. So this was you can see Dino McMahon is holding I assume the league championship trophy there, and Chuck Cashman is holding their jersey, which has a really nice emblem. I like that flying eagle, and I'm surprised nobody else has picked up on that one. And I just wanted to say a few words about Carl Sainert. He was a cop. I don't know if he was still a cop at this time or if he had just retired, but great big bear of a guy, real nice. And he ended up writing for the People's Press. He wrote articles about the hockey team. And when I played in 70, especially in the 71-72 season, he wrote some incredible articles, as you'll see in one of the later episodes, about our hockey team, and had pictures of the guys, had quotes, had long detailed descriptions. I mean, it was like we had a beat writer following us around, and it was a really great way to chronicle our team back then. So, and you know, he was another guy. Both him and Ron Woody, I don't think, had any hockey background. They didn't grow up being rink rats. So, but these guys were willing to devote their time unpaid and make the community and the hockey team both better, and they helped out where they could, and they did a great job. So hats off to all the people who volunteered, making coaching and just helping out with the teams. After this year, Ron Woody quit coaching in Owatonna and moved up to the city somewhere and became involved with hockey up there. And he was really one of the pioneers of amateur hockey in the U.S. And also he was kind of a stereotype for the kind of people that may not have grown up as rink rats and didn't know hockey. I mean, but they were willing to give their time, devote their time unpaid, do what they could to help hockey in their community grow and thrive. And he definitely did that. As I mentioned before, he owned the Dairy Queen down right on the east side of Central Park in Owatonna, and so that would close up and he'd have the winter free. But He had quite the coaching record. I mean, he had some real powerhouse teams, and became a student of the game later on. And I'm sure he left the practices, let the like Doug Austin or I think Gary McCord helped him out later on, but let those guys run the practices and do the drills and everything, and he would organize everything and make the team work. But I went through all of his midget and juvenile coaching records. There were a couple years I couldn't find, so based on my knowledge, he had 104 wins versus 12 losses in all the time that he coached. So it's almost a 90% win rate. So he whatever he was doing, it worked. He was the Minnesota Amateur Hockey Association president from 71 to 73. One of the founders of the United States Hockey League, and also the founding father of the St. Paul Vulcans. And if you're not aware of the Vulcans back in the 70s, they pretty much provided all the players for the backbone of the team for Herbie Brooks at the University of Minnesota, and they went on to win 3 championships during that span. So him and Doug Woog put together some good teams for the Vulcans. And he was named the USHL General Manager of the Year in 83-84. And that year the Vulcans won both the Anderson and Clark Cups. I'm not familiar with those cups, but I'm sure they're prestigious, and you're playing against other teams that have won their league. So it's pretty prestigious to win both of them in the same year. He was the USHL president from 79 to 81 and league treasurer from 85 to 90. He was vital to the merger of the USHL and the Midwest Junior Hockey League in 79. And the MVP of the USHL Prospects / All-Star Game is awarded the Ron Woody Award, which they've given out since 1990. So it's pretty prestigious. And he did a great job after he left Owatonna. So those are the kind of people that help make good hockey programs and good communities. And hats off to him for all the work that he did during those years. 1967 was another crazy year. You had a lot of people, a lot of young kids who were questioning the authority, and they were kind of doing their own thing. They were having a lot of music festivals. There's people going out to, this was the Summer of Love, so a lot of people headed out to San Francisco and the West Coast and just kind of hung out and free love, smoking pot, getting high. It was a crazy time, and a lot of the country didn't know how to react to these guys. So there was a lot of social change going on then, and we still had the Vietnam War going on. Guys were getting killed all the time, and we were being bombarded with that every night on the news. So it was a very turbulent era, as I've said. This is a picture of the 1967 midget team that was also good, and a lot of these guys went on to play for the high school team then in 68, 69, and also one of the guys ended up coaching. So let me go through the players here. The front row is Bob Grotham, John Hosfield, Pat Kennevan, Doug Austin, Tom Bugger McLaughlin, Mike Dowland, Tom Freeberg. And in the back is Shannon Owen, Howie Peterson, Rick Heiseke, Mike Hinkle, Jack Hara, Pat Garrity, and he was the assistant coach, and Dudley Otto was the coach. So that was the first team that Dudley coached in Owatonna. So, and a lot of these guys ended up playing for him on that first high school team: Shannon, Howie, Rick, Jack Hara, Mike Dowland, Tom Freeberg, and Tom McLaughlin. So, a couple of things in this picture I find kind of interesting. I mean, Look at how big Mike Hinkle is compared to Jack Hare. I mean, Jack Hare, even with his nice thick black hair there, barely comes up to Hink's or to Haas's shoulder. And I guess Mike Hinkle was encouraged by Judge Charlie Cashman to start hanging out with the hockey team. So, and to keep him on the straight and narrow. And so, anyway, John Hosfield here, his younger brother Jim, who is like like Sasquatch. He never shows up in these photos. I'm sure he'll show up in the high school ones, but I think there's been one picture of Jim Hosfield through all the midget teams and all the Pee Wee and Bantam teams, so putting out an APB for him. This is the rest of the newspaper article. It just talks about the team. They were currently leading the Southern Suburban Midget League with a 5-1 record, despite losing to Edina for their first loss last weekend. And it said the only player missing in that picture was Mark Wongan, who also played on the high school team. So, these guys may not have been quite as good as the previous teams, but they were holding their own. This newspaper article in '67 that talks about the midget team that won the consolation and the sportsmanship trophies at that tournament. And in the picture is Pat Kenneman. He's holding the consolation trophy, and then they each got a bronze medallion. Wonder if Doug still got that around. And said the two were the captains of the team, and Pat Kenneman, no surprise, was the leading scorer, and Doug, it said he had 94 stops during those 3 games they played at the tournament. And that's quite a few shots when you're getting over 30 shots on you in a game, and these guys were only playing 14-minute periods, so right there you got 18 less minutes per game. And so he must have been peppered pretty good, and that's being a goalie. I know I'd rather be busy than standing around watching the game. So anyhow, they did pretty well. They lost to International Falls in their first game, 7-3, and then they came back and beat Crystal by a 6-2 margin, and then beat St. Paul Phelan for 5-1. So over that span of teams, they did pretty well. It says they got 1 title, runner-up on 4 other occasions, and a couple of sportsmanship trophies and a consolation bracket trophy. And the article went on to say that Glenn Avon out of Duluth won the title, and third place was International Falls, who beat Owatonna. So pretty good. They had a pretty good run there. So it said Doug played in the net all the way, and 94 stops, only had let in an average of a little over 3 goals a game. It said against the first game against International Falls, Shannon Owens scored in the first period, Pat Kenneman the second, and Howie Peterson on an assist from Tom Freeberg in the third. Then they beat up on Crystal pretty good. It says they beat them 6-0. Well, either 6-2 or 6-0, whatever they won by. The people who scored were Jack Hara, assist by Freeberg, Tommy McLaughlin, assist from John Hosfield, Shannon Owen got a goal, assist by Kenneman and Freeberg. Anyway, don't need to go through all those, but they ended up beating Phelan 5-1, and the usual suspects were scoring the goals: Kenneman, Freeberg, Kenneman, and then it just goes through and gives the names of the teams. So Doug and Pat, this was their last year in midgets, and you may have noticed in those, maybe you didn't, but in the '66 juvenile picture, Doug Austin was in there as a goalie, so he was not only playing midgets, but he was probably playing juveniles also. So he was a pretty busy guy on top of also wrestling for the high school. 1968 was an extremely turbulent year all over the world. I mean, there were political assassinations, there were protests against the war, there were the Soviets invaded the Czechoslovakia. I mean, one thing after another, and that would take a whole presentation just to go over everything that happened in 1968. But the Tet Offensive had taken place, and we now had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and looked like no end in sight. The only information I have from 1968 is this program from the State Midget Hockey Tournament that just shows that Owatonna went to it. And just going through, you can see our roster up there in the right side of the page. The goalies back then were J.C. Pegg and Bruce Abraham. So I couldn't remember that Abe was a goalie, but next time I run into him, I'll have to ask him about that. Then you had Al Krippner, Jim Hosfield, Gary Johnson, Mike Dowland, Dan Anhorn, Tom Freeberg, Tom McLaughlin, Howie Peterson, Larry Jandro, Jack Hara, Danny Morris, Mark Wong, and Dan Gritz, and Rick Heisekes. And the coaches were Duds and Bill. So other than a few guys, this was the high school team of the next year, and so they were getting experience playing in a midget tournament at that point. And I also wanted to point out on Roseville, there's a guy named Mark Eagles, and I believe that a couple years after this, Dan Boke and Mark Christa went up to Bemidji State and played with Mark Eagles. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then St. Paul Hayden Heights, they had a guy named Les O.J., and he became a big standout for the Gophers during some of their NCAA championship teams. This shows some of the other team rosters. I looked through some of these guys. St. Paul Phelan, it said the coach was Bob Johnson, and Doug said this is Badger Bob, who went on to coach high school. He may have been coaching high school at this point right there, but he went on to coach the Badgers to a number of NCAA championships, and then the Penguins, I think he won the Stanley Cup with them. So pretty interesting to see some of the names that pop up in these. Bob Peltier, another one of the Peltier brothers, is also on that Phelan team. So they were going through St. Paul Johnson, and it was just a regular annual ritual that one of the Peltiers, or maybe more than one Peltier, would be in the state championship playing for St. Paul Johnson. This is just the bracket, shows the brackets. Edina beat Owatonna in the first game, and then doesn't say much about what happened after that. So I didn't hear whether they won a consolation. They may have been beaten their next game by, would have been, I guess, St. Paul Hayden Heights, since they lost also. So anyway, that's all the info I have on that. And in September 2018, we had a 50-year reunion for the start of the high school hockey program in Owatonna. And we brought back a lot of the old-timers who played back in the midget teams. And so in 2018, we had a 50-year reunion for the start of the high school hockey program in Owatonna. And the committee thought it would be a great idea if the guys who were on the midget and juvenile teams, and even before that, received honorary hockey varsity letters. These guys were on these powerhouse teams. Unfortunately, there wasn't high school hockey at that time, but they were really the guys that did the heavy lifting and got the community behind the idea that high school hockey could succeed in Owatonna, which it has. So, these guys showed up in the front. Well, standing there left to right is Tom Stanton, Dino McMahon, John Kupke, Pat Kennevan, Doug Austin and the great Noel Janke. Then Mark is the MC, and Todd Hale is behind him on the podium. So it was a real great honor that these guys were able to go up there and be acknowledged for what they did in their youth. And Noel was, these guys were really emotional. This was a special moment for them, and I'm glad they went through with this. This is a picture of Terry Casperson receiving his letter, and I titled it "The Camaraderie Remains After All These Years." For a fleeting few seconds, remember all those times that you went to battle out on the hockey rink, and remember, you look at that guy and you go, yeah, I remember when that guy pulled us through, scored a couple key goals, and you remember when you're young and full of energy, could do everything, and you see these old guys, it doesn't matter how beat up their body is or how much weight they've gained, and whether they have fatigue or not, they're still your comrades, you can't say in arms, but so to say out on the hockey rink, and you're always going to remember those special times with those guys. And this is just a picture of a few more of the guys who weren't in the previous picture. Jim Herzog, I think he was the guy that kind of got the deal going between the school and getting the varsity letters. And then you have Terry Casperson, Eric Austin, who accepted for his dad, Jim, and then Tom Stanton, Dino McMahon, John Kupke, and Pat Kennevan. And then Mark is behind. So, this was a great group of guys, and their legacy is a lot of great hockey teams that came out of Owatonna back in the 60s, that represented Owatonna and Minnesota very admirably. And, hats off to these guys. They were my heroes growing up. So after the 67-68 season, that was the last year that we had midget and juvenile teams. And the high school Owatonna School Board voted to add hockey to the high school winter sports program as a major sport. So that worked out, and after this episode, we'll move on to the high school team. So hang on. So if you have any questions or comments, just contact me at stevemcgoff@gmail.com. If you have old pictures, old newspaper articles about any of the hockey in Owatonna, that would be incredible, at least up until 75. After that, I don't know much about the program because I wasn't living there. But anyway, hope you enjoyed this, and next episode will be about the high school teams. Thank you.